"Who the hell do you think you are? Just because you wear a damn judge's robe, you think you can order me around?" He screamed into the face of the black judge, then slapped him across the face in open court like he was disciplining a criminal. But seconds later, that slap turned into a noose around the neck of the very system he had relied on to abuse his power. This wasn't just an act of personal disrespect. It was the price of brazen arrogance in a United States courtroom. Where are you? Watch till the end, because this time justice won't stop until the whole system bows down. The state courthouse, nestled among the cold concrete blocks of a southern U.S. city, opened its first hearing of the week that morning. The case seemed trivial at first glance. A 16-year-old black boy was charged with obstructing a law enforcement officer. The reason noted in the report displayed a defiant attitude when looking at the officer. His name was Jalen Ford, a 10th grade student, skinny, with a baby face still speckled with pimples, like any kid unprepared for the weight of the world. Jalen didn't cry, but he didn't lift his head either. He sat with hunched shoulders inside an oversized shirt, as if trying to shrink himself under the gaze of the powerful people in the room. The plaintiff's bench was prepared for a key witness, Officer Travis Brantley. He entered without hurry, without hesitation. His steps were heavy, thick like the uniform he wore, the bright beige patrol suit used by the state troopers, stiff enough to make his shoulders look nearly twice the width of an average man. A police badge stood out on his left shoulder, and a nameplate reading Brantley was pinned to the right side of his chest. No introduction was needed. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere, gradually pulling the courtroom from hushed chatter into complete silence. His polished black boots struck the wooden floor with clarity, each step landing like a declaration of dominance, not of a witness arriving, but of someone asserting territory. Malcolm Varelli, the presiding judge, watched Travis enter with eyes cold as steel. He gave no expression, only tilted his head slightly so the clerk could record the witness's arrival. The black man with silver hair had nothing flashy about him. He didn't need to strike the gavel, raise his voice, or assert his position. His calm alone, maintained throughout the morning, was enough to make many in the room straighten their posture. But Travis, as if deliberately resisting that order, slouched into the witness chair with a casual lean, legs stretched out. He glanced at Malcolm, not too long, but without a trace of hesitation. "Officer Brantley, I'll ask you to recount the events of that evening," Malcolm said, his voice even and firm, devoid of any excess tone. Travis clicked his tongue. "I was on routine patrol in residential zone number 8. A group of teenagers had gathered on the sidewalk. When I instructed them to disperse, the subject, Ford," he shot a resentful look at Jalen, "stared directly at me, unmoving. That attitude was enough to assess a threat." Malcolm jotted down a few notes. "Can you specify what action made you consider it a threat?" "The look," Travis replied. "In my line of work, that kind of stare is the first sign of defiance. I've handled many similar situations. If I don't control it from the start, the consequences will be worse." A silence no one called for settled over the room, and yet everyone observed it. Malcolm looked up, locking eyes with Travis. "So, you identified a threat based on eye contact?" "Exactly. And your response was?" "I ordered the subject to lower his head and take his hands out of his pockets. When he didn't comply, I placed my hand on his shoulder and ordered cooperation. The subject resisted, so I used a takedown maneuver." Jalen's body tensed at the phrase, "takedown maneuver." No one in the room spoke, but several eyes began exchanging silent doubt. Malcolm enunciated each word. "That 16-year-old boy, how tall is he?" "About 5'3", Travis answered without pause. "And you?" "Nearly 6'3". Still no one spoke, but this time a few people in the gallery leaned forward slightly. The numbers, though voiceless, had just spoken in the clearest language possible. Malcolm closed his notebook and placed it on the desk, fingers interlocked. His eyes no longer held that earlier calm. They had been sharpened by something keener than silence. "Thank you, Officer Brantley," he said. "Your testimony will be cross-checked against the surveillance footage and statements from civilian witnesses." Then he turned to the court clerk. "Record everything. especially the part describing the look. Inside the courtroom, no one spoke, but the atmosphere was no longer the same as when Travis had walked in, and for Malcolm Varelli, that was only the first question. Malcolm Varelli sat upright on the bench, his hands neatly resting on the dark wooden surface. The light pouring through the tall window cast a shadow across his nose, outlining a face marked by experience. His silver hair was neatly combed, and the thin frame of his glasses reflected a soft light, like a boundary between calm and authority. He never adjusted his chair, never bowed his head to flip through files, and did not flinch when Travis Brantley sat across from him, bringing with him the presence of someone stepping into familiar territory, as if in control. Travis glanced at Malcolm up and down, his gaze brushing past with undisguised disdain, as if the judge before him was just another black-robed scholar, someone who sat high, read too much, and understood too little of what happened on the streets. To him, that bench could be a place where a black man sat, if he knew how to stay silent, but the man before him was not someone who easily overlooked offense. That composure was not born of meekness. It came from having once stood in the crossfire without ever needing to raise his voice. Malcolm leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice low and clear. "I need you to recount the events accurately." Travis shrugged as if the question was expected. "I think I know what a threat looks like better than you do." The words struck the air like a slap, loaded with insinuation. Behind him, a few colleagues, watching from the audience, raised their eyebrows, not out of shock, but familiarity. That was how Travis spoke to anyone he didn't respect. Condescending at first, dominating midway, and, if needed, crushing by the end. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He removed his glasses, wiped them gently with a small cloth folded in his breast pocket. The deliberateness of his motion made the entire courtroom pause with him. When he put his glasses back on and looked up, his gaze cut directly into Travis, not harsh, but unwavering. "Good," Malcolm said. "Then I would also like to know how you determined the threat. At what moment, and based on what criteria? Can you elaborate?" Travis shifted slightly, his biceps tightening under the thick fabric, neck joints twitching the way people used to react more than think often do. I've seen hundreds of looks like that. The kid stared at me like he wanted to provoke something, and in a neighborhood with a high crime rate, I didn't have the luxury of losing the upper hand. Malcolm interrupted. "You said his look was provocative. What exactly do you mean?" He didn't flinch, no signs of cooperation, and the way he lifted his chin, that's a common form of nonverbal defiance. A sigh rose from the left side of the gallery. Malcolm didn't turn, but he noted it. The emotion in the room was shifting, from curiosity to doubt, and from doubt to discomfort. Travis didn't notice. He spoke in the voice of someone who had once been praised for decisiveness in the field, and had never been challenged from a leather chair above. Malcolm turned to the clerk again. Voice steady, record in full, including the part about chin height. Then he looked toward Jalen Ford, the boy still bowing his head, hands on his knees, silent like his own shadow. Malcolm paused for a moment, then turned back to Travis. "Thank you. I have only one more question." Travis raised an eyebrow, signaling readiness. "If the subject had been a white teenager in a school uniform with a backpack and looked at you the same way, would you have considered that a threat?" Travis gave a short laugh, about to respond, but Malcolm raised a hand. "Don't answer if you're not certain. Your testimony's already long enough." The room grew taut, like a sheet of paper about to tear. Travis shifted his shoulders, leaned on the armrest, but his eyes no longer held steady. Those who watched closely could see his jaw clench slightly, as if grinding down something he couldn't quite say. Malcolm tapped the desk lightly. "The court will resume after the counsel reviews the surveillance footage. This session is adjourned for 10 minutes. The door opened. No one spoke, but from where he sat, Malcolm Varelli knew the only language Travis had just unknowingly used was the very one that would unravel this entire trial. Not a shout, not a blow, but the way he believed that even a gaze could have a color. Travis Brantley sat up straighter when asked to clarify his actions at the scene. He didn't avoid the question, nor did he show any sign of concern. On the contrary, his demeanor resembled that of someone far too accustomed to justifying conduct with the phrase, standard procedure. He recounted the events in a flat, steady tone as if delivering a routine morning briefing. When I signaled, the subject stood still, did not respond. I repeated the order twice, more firmly. Still no movement. Based on experience, that's a sign of potential resistance. I acted immediately to prevent escalation. Malcolm looked up from his notes, cutting in the moment Travis finished speaking. How long did you press the boy's head to the ground? About 10, maybe 12 seconds, until I could get control of his hands. And was he armed? No, Travis responded without the slightest hesitation. His tone carried not a hint of unease. Did you learn that before or after pinning him down? After, he replied, then quickly amended, but the check happened fast. I had to act before any risk materialized. Malcolm maintained eye contact, writing nothing. A single, quiet breath seemed to sweep through the room, heavy and suffocating. In the gallery, the soft sound of paper and pen stirred, as if some observers had begun jotting down the details they did not want to forget. And Malcolm asked, softly and slowly, in your view, what made someone like Jalen a threat? Travis tilted his head slightly, a flicker of caution crossing his expression. I've seen too many incidents start from seemingly harmless behavior. Hands in pockets, no reply, standing still in a confrontational stance. Those are early signs. I can't afford to wait for him to pull something out. And your response was to force him to the pavement, in full view of the neighborhood? Yes. That's a trained reflex, Travis replied, like a line rehearsed many times. Malcolm leaned back slightly, setting his pen down, fingers interlaced. His gaze no longer interrogated. It now searched deeper. You say it's a reflex, he repeated, but let me be specific. Was it a professional reflex or a reaction to his skin color? For a few seconds, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Travis clenched his hands on his thighs, lips tightening, as if carefully selecting his next words with rare deliberation. I responded to the situation, not to race, he answered, more slowly than usual, and I followed exactly what I was trained to do. Malcolm didn't move. There was no need to press further because the answer had not served to clarify the facts, but rather to lay the groundwork for what was to come. He turned to the court clerk and signaled to record the witness's final statement. Then he opened another thin file. In your record, Malcolm continued, it states that you used similar physical measures on another suspect last year. That individual was a white teenage girl suspected of stealing an electric scooter, but you did not pin her to the ground. Why not? Travis looked surprised, but only briefly. That situation was different. She didn't display threatening behavior. We have to assess each scenario in its full context, Travis answered, trying to maintain an even tone. Malcolm offered no further comment. He set the folder aside, then said slowly, I'm not sitting here to reread every case file, but when two identical actions receive different responses, justice is not allowed to remain silent. He bit his lower lip gently, then looked away. Inside the courtroom, eyes began to turn toward Malcolm as if waiting for someone to speak aloud what the society had buried for far too long. He did not disappoint them. We often cite skills, procedures, and protocols, but if all those things only activate when the person across from you has a certain skin color, then it is no longer skill. It is a mislearned reflex. The sentence was not delivered with emphasis, but it echoed deeply, like a first crack threading its way through walls once thought unbreakable. And Travis, who had always believed himself the embodiment of order, began to feel like he was standing in front of a mirror he could no longer control. Travis Brantley was not the type to stay silent when put on the defensive. He was used to barking commands during patrols, to pointing and ordering without being questioned. When Malcolm raised the distinction between professional reflex and unconscious reaction to skin color, he snapped back, his tone barely concealing his frustration. We deal with these people every single day, Your Honor. The words fell into the courtroom like a lit match. They were no longer an excuse. They were a confession, unintentional but complete. The words, these people and we, in the same breath, needed no further explanation to draw an invisible but undeniable line between those being monitored and those with the power to enforce that monitoring. Malcolm nodded slowly, almost calmly. But within that silence, something shifted. He no longer needed to press. "Good," he said without emphasis. That last sentence was the evidence I needed. The air in the courtroom thickened. Some in the gallery exchanged glances. As for Travis, perhaps for the first time that day, he sensed that the gap between his words and their consequences was no longer buffered by the safety he had once enjoyed in internal hearing. Malcolm turned toward the plaintiff's side and gestured for the recording officer to pause, so the hearing could move to the next stage. He pulled out a thin, worn file, older than the current cases under review, and laid it gently on the table. That file had not been listed in the pre-trial submissions, but it carried weight, not because of thickness, but because its contents had once been pushed aside. "I want to revisit an incident from 5 years ago," Malcolm said, his eyes still fixed on Travis. "At the time, you were the responding officer in a nighttime traffic stop. The victim was Renee Marshall." Travis raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that case to resurface. "She was speeding, ran a red light?" "There is no verified evidence of that," Malcolm replied at once. "No recorded footage and no official report was ever filed after that night. But according to later statements, you ordered her out of the vehicle, questioned her repeatedly, and held her documents beyond the permitted time." "I followed procedure," Travis said, his voice rising. Team acted suspiciously. Vigilance was mandatory. "Vigilance is not a license to make someone feel hunted," Malcolm replied. His tone did not rise, but each word carried weight. "And suspicion in this case seems not to have been determined by behavior, but by identity." Travis fell silent for a moment, then muttered, "I don't discriminate. I just do what's required." "And who taught you that a glance, a posture, or skin color could substitute for evidence?" Malcolm asked directly, without circling the point. "Who decided your instinct was enough to override everything written down on paper?" Travis did not answer. His shoulders stiffened slightly, his jaw tightened. The feeling of losing control began to surface through the smallest of movements. Malcolm sat upright, neither imposing nor moralizing. He simply looked at Travis like someone who wanted to listen but had already heard enough. "We're not here to strip away an officer's reflexes," he said. "We just want to understand why that reflex always targets the same kind of people, and why the justifications change, but the victims always look the same." The statement did not ask for a reply. It didn't need to, because when someone says aloud what the entire room has long sensed, the silence that follows is no longer absence, it is agreement. Beneath the rows of gallery seating, Renee Marshall sat still. She had grown used to being forgotten, but today, when her name was spoken in the name of justice, not as a silent witness, but as a turning point, she didn't need to do anything more. Because the man who once thought himself above reproach had dragged the truth into the light by the very words he had grown used to saying. The struggle lasted only a few dozen seconds, but the image it left behind would linger far longer. Travis Brantley exited the courtroom with his hand clenched tightly around the collar of Jalen Ford's shirt, dragging the boy down the hallway like an object being hauled away. There was no explanation, no official escort order, no lawyer present. His hand gripped the fabric of the black child's shirt, as if restraining a dangerous threat in an emergency. Yet Jalen didn't struggle, didn't scream. He limped along, thrown off balance by the force, his sneakers scraping the floor and leaving smudged black streaks like the trail of an arrest that wasn't truly an arrest. Tonya Ford appeared just in time to see her son being pulled through the main corridor. She barely got the first word of her cry out before 2 guards blocked her path, arms outstretched and commanding in tone. "Step back. Protocol in progress." Tonya didn't retreat, but she couldn't push forward either. She just repeated the same 3 words. "That's my son." Her voice wasn't pleading, it was pressed down to the bottom of her being, as if every fear and fury had been compacted until breathless. One of the guards remained impassive, while the other motioned for Travis to quickly move the boy out of sight. All of it unfolded in front of a hallway employee, someone who had been standing there unnoticed from the beginning. The phone in his hand began recording the moment Travis grabbed the boy's collar. No shouting, No sudden motion, just a shaky frame that captured everything. Jalen's helpless gaze, the despair on his mother's face, and the way that beige uniform moved like a symbol of unrestrained authority. Within 3 minutes, the first video appeared online under the headline, "Dragging a Child from Court. Is it any different from dragging justice away from the people?" No editing tools, no commentary needed. What happened was enough for viewers to draw their conclusions. In the comments section, voices began to appear in waves. How did no one stop this? Why is a child being treated like a terrorist? Is this a courtroom or a forced training camp? What kind of justice lets a mother's son get dragged like an animal? Within 6 hours, the clip had been shared over 30,000 times, garnering hundreds of thousands of views. Locals started gathering outside the courthouse fence, holding hand-drawn signs. Justice doesn't drag. Hands off our kids. You fear what you never tried to understand. No leader organized the gathering, no speakers or stages, just ordinary people stopping by after work to look at a place once considered sacred, now a deep wound in the community's trust. Inside the courtroom, Malcolm Varelli knew the clip had gone viral. He didn't need to check his phone. The shift in the reporter's eyes, the changed posture of attending law enforcement officials, the way a few young staffers looked at him as if he wasn't just a judge, but someone capable of changing something. All these told him the truth had escaped the courtroom walls. Travis Brantley still hadn't realized the gravity of what he had done. To him, it was simply another sequence of situation control maneuvers he had been trained to perform. What he couldn't control, however, was the chain reaction of a society weary of justifications and rehearsed scripts. When reality appears on camera, excuses lose their power. And while Travis still believed he was enforcing justice, millions had already begun to ask a different question. Is justice something dragged away from the powerless? Or is it what must stay when a child is pulled through a courtroom? Renee Marshall sat alone in the small editing room of the local newsroom, the light from the screen casting her face in a sleepless glow. She had replayed the footage more than 20 times, pausing at every small moment. Jalen's eyes before being taken, Tanya's hand reaching for nothing as she was blocked, and Travis's expressionless face as he held a child by the collar like a piece of seized evidence. Renee didn't need anyone to tell her what was wrong. She understood, not through logic, but through memory. Years ago, when she was a sophomore journalism student, she had been stopped by Travis Brantley on her way to an internship. No clear reason, no cited violation, just a demand for identification and a wary look, as if she were a threat in broad daylight. Back then, she stayed silent, like many black people, taught that silence might be the only way to walk away from an encounter without injury. But today was different, not because she had become a well-known journalist, but because a boy was being turned into a new version of herself, in court, in front of cameras, under the public's gaze. That made it impossible for her to remain distant from the story. Renee began tracing old case files, arrests that had involved Travis Brantley. Beneath each line of the report was an incomplete story. Detainees without charges, instances of reporting failure. Internal complaints are sealed under confidential stamps. The deeper she dug, the more patterns emerged. Aggressive behavior, lack of legal basis, and one undeniable point. Most of the subjects were people of color. It was no longer a coincidence. It was the mark of a hidden rule guarded by power and silence. That afternoon, she received a message from the courthouse. An unexpected appointment with Malcolm Varelli. No one in the press had ever been invited privately by him. Malcolm was not one to engage with the media, let alone leak information. But this time, he initiated the contact. The meeting took place in the room behind the judicial library. No cameras, no recording, no clerks. Just two people who understood exactly what kept the system running and what was starting to fracture it. Malcolm stood as Renee entered, offered her a seat, then slowly poured water as if the entire conversation needed to begin with a breath long enough to hold everything that mattered. "I read your latest piece," he said. "Your analysis is accurate, but not complete." His voice wasn't sharp, but it carried the weight of experience. Renee opened her notebook, ready to take notes, but Malcolm raised a hand to stop her. "I didn't call you here to be a source. I don't need a sensational article, and I don't want to see my name in a bold headline, but I need you to do what few dare to, go to the root." Renee looked up, her eyes widening slightly, not from surprise, but from weighing his words. Malcolm looked straight at her, his voice lowering. "You're brushing against a branch of something deeply planted. If you dig to the roots, but protect yourself first. The price of truth isn't cheap, and they won't stop at threats." She nodded. No further promise was needed. In her eyes was a light Malcolm had seen before in people who did not turn away when wrong was happening right in front of them. He knew he couldn't stop her, but at the very least he could caution her before she became the next name buried in a pile of internal files no one ever bothered to reopen. When Renee stepped out of the room, the sky had turned to bronze. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but this time she would not flinch. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need a loudspeaker. It only needs one person determined enough to pick up the pieces the system deliberately lets fall. And she had begun. In a closed meeting inside the Judicial Records Archive, Malcolm Varelli instructed the Legal Support Division to review 3 past cases handled by Travis Brantley. These cases were scattered across the last 6 years, each showing signs of excessive force, but never re-examined after the conclusion. A shared pattern in the reports stood out: inconsistencies between police statements and witness accounts, and the unusual disappearance of surveillance footage, often marked as unusable. For those familiar with how the system operated, none of this was new. But Malcolm knew that if such details kept being dismissed as procedural accidents, then the system he served was no different from those exploiting it. He signed the motion for retrial, requesting the reopening of all original investigative files, and sent it to the Office of Judicial Administrative Oversight. Before submitting, he spent over an hour alone in his office, rereading every faded line in the old reports. Phrases like, "Suspect was unresponsive, had to use restraint techniques," and "no signs of misconduct found," repeated endlessly, as if copied from a single template. With each reading, he scribbled the same note in the margins. Who wrote this? Not to seek a name, but to ask why such absurdities had gone unchallenged for so long. But less than 24 hours after submission, the response from the state judiciary leadership came back brief. Request to reopen case denied. Reason: outside the state's jurisdiction over cases previously approved for internal resolution per regulations. The reply was short, unsurprising, yet heavy. It confirmed what Malcolm had faced his entire career, a system that preferred calm over truth. He sat upright after reading it, neither slamming the desk nor sighing, but his gaze shifted. That silence wasn't resignation. It was a calculation. Malcolm called the court's legal advisor and asked whether any statute allowed a state judge to propose an independent investigation upon discovering new evidence, even if the case had been closed internally. The voice on the other end hesitated, then promised to review the matter before replying in writing. Malcolm didn't wait. He began drafting a handwritten, 3-page memorandum listing every point of concern in the 3 cases. At the end, he did not request reconsideration. He declared, when a system refuses to revisit errors that may endanger lives, we are no longer delivering justice. We are maintaining a defensive order for ourselves. That afternoon, he brought the handwritten report directly to the chairman of the State Judicial Council. No appointment, no secretary. The council head, a man who had been Malcolm's colleague for nearly 20 years, saw him walk in and immediately understood. This was not a social visit. Malcolm placed the file on the desk and got straight to the point. I'm not here to ask permission. I'm here to inform you that I will exercise personal authority to request an independent investigation if you continue to decline. The other man looked down at the document, skimmed a few lines, then looked up and said slowly, "You know we are bound by the framework." Malcolm responded without pause. The framework was built to uphold justice, not to cage it. The conversation did not continue. Malcolm stood and left the room without waiting for promises. He knew from that moment he had stepped out of the comfort zone of a judge's role. But he also knew one truth: justice holds value only when its enforcers are willing to pay the price for truth. And if those 3 cases were sealed doors hiding something rotten, then he would be the first to turn the handle, even if blood had to spill from his knuckles. After digging deeper into the cases Travis Brantley had been involved in, Renee Marshall began to uncover fragments no one had bothered to piece together. In the basement of the press archive, she flipped through old reports, articles lumped into the urban security or disorderly conduct sections. Headlines were often reduced to dry phrases like "Police intervene, no injuries reported," or "Suspect displayed resistance, situation stabilized." But when she cross-checked the dates, locations, and names of the individuals arrested, she found a troubling pattern. In many cases, the detainees were students, young laborers, or college workers, most of them people of color. She reached out to a man named Raymond Ellis, who had filed a complaint against Travis in 2018. He was a truck driver, pulled over for a dim tail light, then dragged from his cab while on a video call with his daughter. Raymond had submitted a complaint to the Internal Affairs Division, but never received a response. Every time he called, he was met with the same line: "The complaint has been handled according to internal procedures." When Renee asked how he felt hearing that again after 4 years, Raymond simply said, "I think when they say internal, they're not talking about procedure. They mean a room without light." Renee continued contacting others. One was Amira Johnson, a senior at a local university. She had been detained for 4 hours at a precinct after responding to Travis stopping her car for showing tense behavior. She recalled, "I had just gotten out of class, was on the phone with my mom. He told me to hang up, step outside, and place my hands on the hood. I asked why, and he said I was showing abnormal signs. That moment I thought I wouldn't make it home." Amira's complaint had also been submitted to the police department, but like so many others, it disappeared. Each testimony was a small drill. Renee didn't record them like a collector, but like someone tunneling through concrete ignorance. Every complaint had been labeled "internally resolved," a phrase legal enough to close any argument, vague enough to avoid specific accountability. When she tied the pieces together, Travis no longer appeared as just a problematic officer. He became the embodiment of power sustained by long-standing silence within a protective structure. That night, after Renee had finished editing the first draft of her report series, Brantley's Shadow Files, she received an anonymous email. The sender's address was unclear, only displaying the name: Devin Reyes. The subject line was plain, not overtly threatening, but the content carried weight. "Don't touch Mercer's man. You're out of your depth." She read the line 3 times. No explanation, no direct demand, no excess detail, just a cold warning, as if the sender was certain she would understand everything it implied. Renee exhaled, her hand still on the mouse, the cursor resting near the Save as Hard Copy button in the bottom corner. She clicked. The draft was printed immediately, the opening sentence unchanged. "When the system stops asking questions, the guilty don't need to run." At the same time, in a different office, Malcolm Varelli received the same email, sent from the same address, only the recipient's name was different. The message was identical. He skimmed it, then leaned back in his chair, hand resting lightly on the table. It wasn't the first thread of his career, but it was the first to name someone specific: Mercer. To Malcolm, the name was familiar. Doyle Mercer had once led the state's Tactical Oversight Unit and had deep ties to key law enforcement figures. In the system, Mercer never needed to issue orders. His presence was enough. Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't save the email either, but he recorded the date, time, and content in his notebook, a page that would never be sent or signed, but always stayed in the top drawer of his desk. Because some warnings aren't meant to be challenged. They're meant to be preserved as evidence of what the system tries to bury along with the truth. And he understood, when threats start showing their face, it means the mask has already begun to fall. That day, no one in the courtroom expected the hearing to be interrupted. But when hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway and the door swung open with enough force to command attention, every gaze turned toward the woman entering. Tanya Ford had no appointment, no access pass, and no legal counsel. What got her past the guards' warning looks and the tension from the gallery seats wasn't authority. It was the fury long held inside a mother who had just watched the video of her son being dragged down a hallway like a piece of trash during a late-day cleanup. She stopped at the center of the room, her breath short but her eyes steady. No one interrupted her. Judge Malcolm gave no signal, did not object. There was something in the way Tanya stood, not loud, not frantic, that told the entire room she didn't need to shout to be heard. "I want to see the video of my son's arrest that day," she said, her eyes fixed on the bench. "I don't need someone to tell me what happened. I need to see it for myself." From the steps, Travis Brantley looked down with a bored expression, as if pulled from a nap. His disdain was clear. His broad frame, shoulders still tense like he hadn't let go of control mode, moved half a step forward before he spoke, each word deliberate. "They're so used to forgiveness, they think they're victims." A ripple of murmurs rose, quickly stifled. Malcolm Varelli remained seated, his right hand resting on the bench, index finger lightly tapping the wood as he often did when thinking. He didn't interrupt Travis, but the look in his eyes told those who had witnessed many hearings that the proceedings had just taken a different turn. Tanya didn't respond. She didn't look away. But half a second after Travis's words, she stepped forward toward the bench. One of the guards moved to intervene, but Malcolm raised a hand, just enough for him to stop. He looked at Tanya and gave a slight nod, granting her space to speak and, just as importantly, affirming that her request would not be dismissed as emotional noise. "I taught my son to stay away from trouble," Tanya said. "Told him never to talk back to officers. Made him memorize every phrase like a survival prayer. 'Yes, sir, I will cooperate. I have nothing on me.' And still he was dragged, pulled, grabbed by the collar like he'd just committed some horror." Her voice caught, but she maintained control. "So I'm asking again, what value does our cooperation hold when even a glance can be deemed a crime?" No one in the room had an answer. Travis turned his head, but no one cared about his reaction anymore. All eyes turned to the bench, where Malcolm sat, carrying not just the duty to rule on conduct, but to keep the very idea of justice from rotting at its foundation. He looked at Tanya again, this time for longer. Then he turned to the court clerk. "I'm requesting the original hallway surveillance footage from the time of the incident," he said firmly. "If there are enough witnesses to reconstruct the scene, then justice deserves a piece of evidence that hasn't been edited." Tanya said nothing more. She stood still for a moment, then nodded, as if Malcolm's words were the only thing she had needed to hear through days of wrestling with fear. Before she left the room, she glanced at Travis once, not to retaliate, not out of hatred, but to let him know that what he did that day would not fade quietly, and this time, not everyone would turn away. Throughout the time Tanya Ford stood in the courtroom, Malcolm Varelli said nothing. He showed neither agreement nor objection, issued no orders to interrupt, and revealed no clear emotion. But his eyes never left her for a single second. Every step the woman took, every wrinkle that tightened at the corner of her eyes when she spoke of her son, was recorded by him like a soundless transcript. There are moments in a professional life when one doesn't need to interrogate to hear the truth. They just need to listen long enough to see it emerge, not from words, but from the way a mother stands firm in a room she knows no one will easily stand with her. When Travis turned away after his sarcastic remark, Malcolm still didn't respond with words, but his hand slowly turned the pen between his fingers, a subconscious motion that senior clerks used to whisper about. Whenever he does that, it means all the data is being rearranged in his head differently. As soon as the hearing ended, Malcolm returned to his office and requested the court's entire legal secretary team to compile a list of witnesses who had appeared in cases involving Travis Brantley. No one asked why, but everyone understood. Those familiar with working under him knew well he never let a single glance pass without calculating its consequences. And the way Travis looked down at Tanya that day, paired with his indifferent words, confirmed what Malcolm needed, not in a legal sense, but in a human one. The next morning, he didn't hold a closed meeting with the council, nor did he circulate a memo. Malcolm signed, personally and directly, the decision to move the trial to the state courthouse's main hall, a space that could hold over 200 people. Simultaneously, he granted media access to the next session under one condition: no live filming during testimonies, but full video coverage was allowed for all other parts of the proceeding. The announcement was posted immediately in the main lobby and caused an instant stir. State-level courts usually avoided excessive media attention, especially when the case involved alleged misconduct by a police officer, but this time no one dared to publicly object. Everyone understood the pressure had reached a level where they could no longer pretend this was just another routine trial. That morning, Renee Marshall was the first to arrive at the hall's entrance. She stood among a slowly gathering crowd, carrying her recorder, notebook, and the gaze of someone who had written enough to know this story would not end with a verdict. Next to her stood Raymond Ellis, the man once pulled from his truck by Travis for a dim tail light. And 2 rows away sat Amira Johnson, the university student once detained for showing signs of nervousness. They had not come because they were summoned. They came because now they felt they could finally witness the truth they once spoke, long denied, being placed back in the public square. Before the hearing began, Malcolm entered through a side door, unannounced, without an escort. He walked directly to the bench, sat down, adjusted the microphone, and then looked up. Without waiting for the clerk's introduction, he spoke first, his voice firm. "I have opened this session not to expose anyone, but to prove that justice is not something meant to function in the dark. We are conducting this trial in public view, not to appease public opinion, but to show that trust cannot be rebuilt behind closed doors." The room fell silent. Journalists stopped typing. Those who had long felt disregarded began to sit up straighter. Malcolm looked around, not settling his gaze on anyone in particular. He added, without drama, "Transparency is the best form of protection, not just for the people, but for those of us who are here to handle the truth." And with that decision, he pulled the entire trial out of the system's tight-lipped mold. It was no longer a dispute between legal parties. It had become a confrontation between justice and what it had long chosen to ignore. When the trial moved into the direct examination phase, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew more tense than even the day the video had been shown. Malcolm Varelli flipped through a thick case file, looking at Travis Brantley with an expression that did not attempt to hide scrutiny. Before posing a question, he allowed a brief pause, not to apply pressure, but to compel the man across from him to face himself. "Have you ever been accused of using excessive force while on duty?" Travis leaned slightly as if preparing to recite a rehearsed response. He raised an eyebrow and replied firmly, "I've received a city commendation for quick control of incidents with no casualties." A few murmurs stirred in the back rows. Malcolm didn't react to the answer, just gave a slight nod of acknowledgement and turned to the next page. He read aloud, slowly, "On May 15th, a report from an internal sergeant documented a case of unlawful detainment lasting more than 6 hours. Victim, Micah Green." Travis lifted his shoulders slightly, as if the name meant nothing. But before he could speak, someone stood up from the gallery. Micah Green, wearing a faded shirt, gripped the seat beside him tightly, eyes scanning the room as if seeking permission to speak. He stepped into the aisle, his voice trembling. I was held by him in a holding room for an entire night." Malcolm put down his pen. Everyone in the room turned to look at Micah, including Renee Marshall, who had compiled a list of individuals whose complaints had been dismissed. She immediately opened her notes. Micah took a deep breath, hands clasped together. "I was stopped near my home for walking without an ID. I asked him for the time, and that's the only reason I was cuffed. He said I was disrespectful, then locked me up without explaining anything." Travis scoffed, glancing at Malcolm as if expecting support. "I followed protocol." He was non-compliant. Malcolm stared directly at Travis, voice steady but each word landing hard. Non-compliant means he refused to identify himself, but the record shows he presented a library card with his full name, and footage from the neighborhood cameras confirms he showed no resistance. Travis blinked, showing his first hint of disorientation. "He looked at me like he was ready to attack," he said, voice louder than before. "I had to ensure safety." Malcolm leaned back, hands interlocked. "You felt threatened by an unarmed man in a white shirt standing under a streetlight asking for the time? And your response was to detain him overnight without a warrant?" Micah still stood in the aisle, hands visibly shaking, but strangely, he didn't lower his head. Travis's words might have humiliated a young man all over again, but this time, the presence of the public and a judge willing to challenge assumptions made all the difference. Micah stood there, shaking but unmoved. A reporter raised a phone, filming Travis's face as he hesitated, and in that fleeting moment, something became visible. The arrogance that had cloaked him began to crack, not because of a dramatic revelation, but because of small things, like Micah standing upright despite his fear, or the slight nod Malcolm gave after noting down the statement. Malcolm concluded the cross-examination with a simple sentence: "I believe the one who can hold their ground in an empty hallway in front of an armed officer is the one who is truly brave." The words sent the entire courtroom into silence. No gavel strike, no formal declaration. Yet from that moment on, the balance had shifted. As for Micah, before leaving the stand, he turned to look at Travis, not to demand justice, but as if to affirm. This time, the truth was not locked in a holding cell. It had stepped out, stood in the light, and was no longer afraid. Travis pointed directly at Micah, as if everything he had just heard was a ridiculous performance that needed to be shut down immediately. "I'll come back to your neighborhood if I have to," he growled, each word slicing through the already thick tension in the air. The crowd behind him erupted, and a few people jumped from their seats, their eyes burning with fury. An older woman clenched the strap of her handbag, lips pressed tightly together, saying nothing, but she did not look away. Micah stepped back half a pace, but his gaze didn't waver. The echo of being detained was no longer present in his voice. What remained was clarity. The worst thing that had ever happened to him was now being spoken aloud, and for the first time, someone was listening. Malcolm set down his pen, eyes leaving the page, then slowly stood. No one dared speak before him, not because he raised his voice, but because he never had to. The way he left his chair, chin level, shoulders steady, it was a signal to the entire courtroom that a line had just been crossed. Malcolm walked to the edge of the bench, not toward Travis nor toward Micah. He simply stopped there, in the center of every gaze, then tilted his head slightly, eyes locking onto Travis. "If you still want to threaten someone, threaten me." Travis froze, his hand still pointing at Micah, but his wrist had begun to tremble. "Because here," Malcolm continued, his tone unchanged, "I'm the one who defines right and wrong." The room fell into silence, not the kind born of shock or fear, but the kind that forced everyone to reckon with the boundary they had just watched being pushed. For the first time in his many years on the bench, Malcolm was not merely acting as a judge, he was standing between human dignity and the contempt hidden behind the mask of law enforcement. Renee Marshall leaned against the doorframe, holding her recorder. She didn't need to write a caption for that segment of audio. Malcolm's words, followed by the extended silence, already made clear who was truly holding the scales of justice and who was trying to shatter them with power. Travis lowered his head for a moment, unclear whether to avoid eye contact or to steady his heartbeat. Moments later, he returned to the witness bench, shoulders slumped. Micah was invited to step out of the aisle, but before heading back to his seat, he paused briefly. He said nothing, but the look he gave Malcolm may have been the most complete form of gratitude, not for being defended, but for not having to bow his head before a shout. For the first time in his life, Malcolm returned to the bench, picked up the gavel, and set it down without a sound. He didn't need to use it to assert authority. Everyone in the room understood that true power now lay not in volume, but in the calm resolve of someone willing to step forward at the right time, in the right place. Behind him, the gallery, once sparsely filled with family members and a few scattered reporters, was now packed. Every pair of eyes followed the slightest movements of the aging judge. For many, this was the first time they had seen the system not deflect, not interrupt, not rationalize wrongdoing. No one stood to applaud, no cheers erupted. But when Malcolm turned to the next page and resumed the hearing, everyone realized this was not just a minor trial over an officer's conduct, it was the clearest moment yet of what happens when someone in power speaks, not to defend the law, but to protect people. And from that point on, no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. Travis stepped up to the bench, his feet heavy but his eyes burning with clear defiance. The distance between him and Malcolm was now less than a single pace, as if he were testing the very threshold of the system's endurance with nothing but his brazen arrogance. Sweat still clung to his temple from the tense confrontation with the previous witness, but Travis pressed forward, each step like an attempt to devour the man seated with the gavel in hand. "Who do you think you are?" Travis growled, not giving anyone time to react. A few in the room leaned forward, feeling the air grow tighter. He wasn't waiting for an answer. He hadn't come to listen. He had come to insult. Smack! The sound cracked through the courtroom like a whip. The slap came without warning, without a raised hand or threat. Malcolm's face jerked sideways in an instant, but his body didn't move. The witnesses were stunned into silence, no one managing a word. Only the gust through the door's frame filled the void left by collective disbelief. Malcolm slowly turned his face back, the red mark on his cheek cut into every line of skin, but his gaze didn't change. It wasn't the look of a man insulted. It was the look of someone who had waited for this moment, to bring an end to the cycle of unchecked power, right at its breaking point. The courtroom security rushed forward. One hand landed on Travis's shoulder. Another reached for a radio, but Malcolm raised his hand, signaling them to stop. No one knew why he didn't allow immediate restraint, but no one dared to question it. He rose. The muscles on his face were still taut from the impact, but his voice was unwavering. "I want this act formally recorded. A serving officer has just assaulted a judge inside the courtroom. No elaboration needed." Travis remained standing, seemingly unaware of the weight of what he'd just done. To him, this was still a personal clash. To Malcolm, it was the clearest evidence of a decaying culture that Travis embodied. A young woman in the front row, hands trembling, unlocked her phone. She hadn't meant to film, but her thumb had already hit record. She knew she was witnessing not just violence, but a turning point. Malcolm looked at the clerk. "Enter my name. Malcolm Varelli. I will file a petition to escalate this to the federal level and request the immediate suspension of Travis Brantley, along with a formal indictment." Travis began to sneer. But the half-smile froze at the sound of footsteps from the back. A middle-aged man in plain clothes entered the room. On the collar of his shirt was the badge of the State Conduct Oversight Commission. He didn't speak his name. He didn't speak at all. He simply walked toward Malcolm and nodded. "We've reviewed the full footage. Judge Varelli, you may continue presiding. As for the officer, he will be taken into custody for investigation." There were no handcuffs needed. That single statement stopped Travis cold. All his life he had leaned on intimidation to hold his place. But this time, the very place he'd scorned, the courtroom, was the one to strip him bare under its light. Renee entered quietly from the door without a camera. Just an old notebook in hand in which she wrote a single line. Not an event, but the moment people stopped being silent. And for the first time in a long chain of abuse cases, a slap was recorded, not as a shock, but as a verdict. Not for Malcolm, but for Travis, and for the system that had long enabled him. Malcolm didn't step back. He didn't touch the mark on his face. He stood still, eyes locked on Travis's face, not in defiance, not in anger, simply a look shaped by years, a gaze that had seen enough to know that what had just been struck was no longer a man. His voice dropped low, yet each word landed like stone against marble. "You didn't hit a person. You hit the very meaning of justice." The words weren't loud, but they were enough to make the entire courtroom freeze. Those present began to realize they were no longer witnessing a minor trial. This was a threshold, a moment when a system had to confront the truth about itself. Renee looked over the shoulders of those in front, her gaze settling on Jalen, the boy still sitting quietly on the defendant's bench, eyes wide as if asking, "Is that justice?" But the answer wasn't in words. It was in what would happen next. A sharp sound came from the rear. The wooden door at the back of the room swung open. 3 people entered. Leading them was Officer Reddick, an officer of federal security known for his composure and unwavering adherence to procedure. No one expected him to appear at a state-level trial, but his presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, as if the entire room had just been placed under a new, unyielding layer of oversight. Reddick needed no introduction, no badge display. He simply walked forward, step by step, and stopped a short distance from Travis. He nodded toward Malcolm, then turned his eyes to the officer who had just caused the disruption. No threats, no rush, just one very simple sentence: "You'll need to come with us. Any behavior showing signs of unlawful conduct will be subject to federal investigation." Travis remained still, as if not fully grasping the situation. He gave a faint, mocking laugh, turning toward a colleague nearby as if expecting the usual shield of protection. But no one spoke. They could no longer pretend not to see. That slap had not only landed on the face of a judge, it had struck at the very reputation of a law enforcement body that had long operated under suspicion. Malcolm quietly stepped down from the bench, saying nothing more. He didn't need to emphasize the insult, nor protect his pride. What he had just defended wasn't personal dignity, it was the legitimacy of justice itself. As he approached Jalen, his eyes softened. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, not to console, but to affirm, "You weren't wrong to look directly." Jalen gave a slight nod. In that moment, the room was so silent that one could hear the pencil in Renee's hand moving across the page. She recorded each event, but what she was truly writing was a turning point. Not because of the spectacle, but because, for the first time, wrongdoing had been halted. Right inside the courtroom, a place once considered safe for people like Travis. As Raddick reached for Travis's arm, the man froze. No reaction, no words. His eyes darted across the room, revealing for the first time something he had always dismissed: hesitation. Not fear of authority, but the dread of someone with nowhere left to run. A man who had behaved as if immune to consequences was now confronting the same form of force he had long imposed on others, this time in the light, under his real name. When the door closed behind the 3 of them, the room still did not move. Everything seemed suspended by the weight of a truth that had just taken shape. Malcolm returned to the bench, took the courtroom gavel, and struck it once. The sound was not to declare a continuation or an end. It was to affirm, the law doesn't need to scream to be heard, even after a slap. Travis turned his head as cold metal clamped around his wrist. The sound of the cuff snapping shut echoed like a bell, marking the end of a long series of actions he had always assumed were his by default. The courtroom watched in silence. No one objected, no one intervened. Even those who once nodded in approval after every decisive move of his now said nothing, as if everyone understood that to speak now would mean aligning themselves with the wrong side. The courtroom doors opened again, this time to the steady steps of a different kind of authority, Captain Doyle Mercer. His command uniform was sharply pressed, the silver insignia on his shoulder catching the ceiling light, casting a familiar presence within the state's law enforcement. He moved swiftly to the center of the room, his eyes tight with barely concealed anger, but wrapped in the calm steel of someone who had weathered crises before. "Acted impulsively," Doyle said, his voice clipped as he addressed Malcolm. "Travis didn't mean to defy the court, Your Honor. It was a moment of temper." He positioned himself partly between the cuffed officer and the man representing justice, a calculated effort to preserve his subordinate's dignity without crossing into outright defense. Malcolm brought the gavel down onto the bench, his gaze steady enough to still the air. "Power does not have the right to be impulsive," he said, each word forged by years of tempered restraint, "especially when it holds the cuffs, especially when it believes it can decide who deserves dignity." Doyle clenched his jaw, saying nothing at first. His eyes locked onto Malcolm's, searching for some opening. But the room was no longer a place for power plays. It had become a space where every title had to stand side by side with accountability. Behind them, Renee kept writing. She turned to a fresh page, her hand steady though her heart surged. She knew this was no longer just a case of abuse or misconduct. It was a collision of two definitions of justice, one rooted in reflex and uniform, the other in deliberate clarity from those once disregarded by that same uniform. Doyle finally stepped back, as if acknowledging that there was nothing left to shield. He didn't defend Travis any further, nor did he ask for leniency. He simply said, his voice soft, like releasing a burden, "I'll transfer the file to the federal level, and I'll take responsibility for the department under my command." For a brief moment, the sound of a few quiet exhales could be heard, like breath escaping the dust of a warped discipline. Travis was escorted out with eyes from every direction. No jeers, no smug satisfaction. Because everyone understood that if such an act was required to push justice back on track, then it wasn't a victory, it was the overdue cost of years of tolerance. As the doors closed behind him, Malcolm returned to his seat, eyes unblinking. He glanced at a file on the bench and turned the first page. Travis's name was on the cover, but inside, he knew, other names would follow, because once the mask falls, the system can no longer pretend not to see. In the hallway, Tonya Ford stared through the glass window. Her eyes no longer burned as they did that first day, but held the quiet patience of a mother once torn from her child in a courthouse corridor. She knew the wound wouldn't heal in a day, but at least today someone had stood up to reclaim a piece of her son's dignity, not with fists, but with a gavel's resounding strike, in a courtroom long buried beneath the silence of the past. Outside the courthouse, the scattered footsteps quickly formed a dense circle. The people brought no flags, no official banners from any organization, but in every hand was a small sheet of paper, the words italicized in black ink. One slap, one wake. That simple phrase seemed to recall the morning when the entire public conscience was jolted awake, not by chance or a first-fired shot, but by the echo of a slap in the most solemn chamber of the state's justice system. One by one, people gathered. There was no leader, no loudspeaker, but each step was a quiet statement that justice could no longer remain silent. Elderly citizens who had witnessed the end of segregation stood beside college students on their first protest. Young mothers carried their babies, holding their children's hands tightly, as if to show them that here is where they would learn why holding your head high is worth more than any lesson in a book. Renee Marshall stood backstage at the National Broadcast Studio, preparing to go live with a special report kept secret until the last minute. She wasn't reading from a teleprompter. What she was about to say had long been etched in her mind, sharpened by sleepless nights, tangled notes, and anonymous calls. This wasn't just another report. For the first time, the name Travis Brantley would be heard without medals or commendations, but as a formal indictment, broadcast across the country. The recording light turned on. The camera panned slowly, settling on Renee's face. No heavy makeup, no forced outrage. She began in a steady voice, each word landing like a blade slicing through the night that had long cloaked public trust. Travis Brantley. An officer was once praised for his command presence, but this morning he turned that command into a blow, delivered to the face of justice itself, and for the first time, a slap didn't make its target bow, it made an entire system rise to see itself. On screen, archival clips played, Travis and photographs with high-ranking officials, blurry footage showing a black man shoved without clear cause, redacted internal memos once rerouted under administrative handling. Everything was shown. There was no place left to hide. Outside, an elderly man with silver hair slowly raised a paper sign to his chest, then turned to a younger man beside him. "You know," he said, eyes still on the growing crowd, "when I was your age, I had to stand in front of water cannons. Now, you just need to stand tall and the world starts paying attention." Applause broke out from a small group across the street. No slogans were shouted, but Every gaze focused on the same spot, the second-story window, where Malcolm Varelli remained in his office. He didn't step outside, didn't join the crowd, but he saw everything, from the line of people forming along the steps to the sheets of paper floating gently in the wind, each one a question he had once asked himself. Could the law truly protect the vulnerable, or was it merely a tool for the powerful? When the studio lights went dark, Renee stepped out of the newsroom. She received a message from an unknown sender. Just one line. You just spoke for many who were never allowed to speak. She closed her phone and took a deep breath. That segment had not been just a news piece. It was the final piece that forced a sealed door to open. That night, the hashtag #OneSlap1Wake spread across social media. No one knew who had coined the phrase, but hundreds of thousands repeated it, not as an insult to Travis Brantley, but as a vow that justice would no longer be struck down without witnesses. And a slap, once seen as a gesture of power, had become the wake-up call for a generation learning how to stand tall again, right in front of the courthouse steps. Cameron Liu never imagined that a late cup of coffee and a stack of old case files could lead to something even seasoned prosecutors dared not touch. He was a junior legal staffer, less than 2 years into the job, usually assigned to review materials for upcoming hearings. But when Renee Marshall contacted him to cross-check records tied to Travis Brantley, something made him pause. It wasn't curiosity. It was a single altered detail. 3 incident reports shared the same manipulated typeface in the testimony sections, with keystrokes noticeably different from the rest of the documents. He began examining each line, checking against internal server data. Every report had a late-day version, followed by a standardized file saved a few hours later. Only 2 people had access during that time window, Travis and a now-retired transcription officer. Cameron didn't report it right away. Instead, he cross-referenced the data, and for the first time, the file on the Crooms family came into clear view. The case dated back 3 years, when Malik Crooms, the 16-year-old son of the Crooms family, was stopped at night under the pretext of suspicion of disposing of evidence. But the original report that Cameron recovered showed no such reason listed on the initial stop order. One untouched annotation on the draft read, "No signs of resistance. Recommend warning and release." That line had been crossed out and replaced with "Non-compliant behavior, signs of aggression." According to the file, Malik had been ordered out of the vehicle, thrown to the ground, and held in a neck restraint for nearly 2 minutes before losing consciousness. He never woke up. His family was told he died from unspecified respiratory failure. There was no footage. His body cam had reportedly malfunctioned. The news barely covered it, reporting it as an uneventful stop that quietly faded. Cameron printed the full originals, including the deleted notes, and brought them to Malcolm Varelli's office. His hands trembled with every step. This wasn't just information. It was direct evidence that Brantley had doctored records to justify the death of an innocent black teenager. As he placed the file on the desk, Cameron looked straight at Malcolm. "I think you need to see the first statement, the one that was never allowed in court." Malcolm read each line as if brushing away the dust from a justice system long used to shielding itself. He said nothing for nearly 10 minutes. Only after reaching the final page did he lift his eyes, cold as ice, and speak with a voice lower than usual. "This isn't about one person's misconduct. This is how the system was built to operate." At that very moment, Renee stood in the Crooms' yard, where Malik's photo still hung quietly on the living room wall. Mrs. Crooms held Renee's hand tightly as she listened to the report that had never been made public. She didn't cry. Her grief had outlived tears years ago. She asked just one question, spoken more like a message. "If they say his name right this time, will others still get stopped in the dark?" Cameron left the office with an encrypted copy, which he delivered to the Federal Division overseeing internal misconduct investigations. Everything was done silently, but each step he took away from the courthouse, people noticed, not because he stood out, but because his eyes had changed. As if for the first time, he understood how silence in a single paragraph could cost a life. And that silence now was beginning to break. from within. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Crooms stood still beside her son's portrait, her gaze sharpened, not by bitterness, but by time and injustice. Her family had once knocked on nearly every door: the inspector's office, the police department, the district attorney's desk, only to receive empty answers and letters marked "resolved" internally. This time, they hadn't come for pity. They came with the original file, recovered by Cameron Liu, and a request to reopen the case filed that same morning. Unlike most cases that often get delayed or rerouted through neighboring jurisdictions, this request was sent directly to the office of the chief judge, and Malcolm Varelli, after reviewing every detail in the old report, cross-referencing the data overwrite timestamps, verifying the last access, chose to take the case, a rare move, and one that meant more than mere procedure. When the notice was pinned to the public board in the courthouse's main hallway, many people paused to read each line carefully. On their faces there was no surprise, only something slowly spreading, the sense that the ground had just shifted slightly, enough to force the entire system to realign. Renee Marshall received the news from a security guard. She stood in the second-floor corridor overlooking the central lobby and saw the middle-aged woman with black-rimmed glasses, the one who had refused many interviews in the past, nodding to a local television reporter. "No one can hide it anymore," someone nearby murmured. The statement wasn't loud, but it tore through the air. Everyone heard it. And then, as if something had just been unlatched, reporters began digging through old files. Attorneys contacted former clients whose requests had once been dismissed. Inside his office, Malcolm reopened the entire Crooms case file, this time not just as a reader but as someone redefining how it would be remembered. He flagged conflicting testimonies and ordered a comparison table between the original and the edited reports. When he reached the line, "No signs of resistance," that had been deleted, he asked his assistant, "How many times has a sentence like that been struck out?" The question was not meant to be answered. It was the beginning of a quiet but resolute audit that Malcolm had just set in motion. Outside, the media began raising questions about Captain Doyle Mercer, the former direct supervisor of Travis Brantley during the Crooms case and the man who had signed off on the records. When chased by reporters, Mercer gave no response, but the image of him rushing into his car, avoiding the cameras, was enough to spark the first flames of a renewed wave of suspicion. The Crooms family left the courthouse without the need for an escort, but the path they took from the courtroom to the parking lot was, for the first time, lined with people standing silently, stepping aside. No one applauded and no signs were held, but their eyes this time did not look down. And in that moment, Mrs. Crooms knew her son's truth had escaped the thick folder and become a warning. When a system denies its purpose, the last witness left is the public. Malcolm did not read the news that day. He spent most of his time preparing subpoenas for 3 former witnesses who had been intimidated by Travis, and in his notebook he wrote a single line: "We've grown too used to redefining the truth until it speaks for itself." This fight was no longer about a child who had been stopped. It was about how an entire system of justice would respond when stripped bare by testimony that could no longer be erased. The largest courtroom in the state courthouse had not a single seat left that morning. The press section was packed, and extra chairs had been lined up along the walls to accommodate citizens in the back. On the raised bench, Malcolm Varelli entered, his dark judge's robe crisp, his expression calm as always, but this time his voice carried a different weight, not louder, but each word sharpened by a lifetime of understanding the system he had served. "Today, we are not here to judge a single man. We are here to examine how an entire institution learned to respond and mistook that response for justice. At the witness stand there was no defendant, just a space, symbolizing the name Travis Brantley, now held in federal security custody. But Malcolm didn't need someone seated there to begin. He needed a structure to be exposed. And he began with exactly that. In every profession, mistakes happen. But what defines us is how we respond to them. When that response becomes a tool for concealment rather than reflection, the system must be re-examined. layer by layer. Renee Marshall sat in the second row, scribbling furiously. She knew this special session would be a catalyst, not just for Travis's case, but for dozens of files once dismissed under the phrase insufficient grounds for further investigation. And this time, the first voice came from someone who once wore the same uniform as Travis, retired Officer Albert Mendez. He stepped up slowly, but once there, spoke without notes. "I trained Travis 5 years ago. He wasn't acting alone, he was the result." The words landed in the courtroom like a blow to one of law enforcement's strongest fortresses. The belief that removing one bad actor cleanses the system. Malcolm neither nodded nor wrote anything down. He simply waited, and only when Albert ended his statement by listing training sessions that used the hooded threat model as a standard reflex drill did Malcolm speak again. "If it took a slap to wake us up, then we've been asleep far too long." There was no added emphasis, but the silence that followed felt like each person was checking themselves. That afternoon, the session continued with a presentation from Cameron Liu, the young man who had uncovered each edited line in 3 of Travis's case files. He stood steady, holding the documents firmly, speaking about bypassed cross-check protocols, forged backup signatures, and how repeated input errors were used as excuses to erase original evidence. Malcolm listened in silence, then turned to the federal prosecutor. "Does anyone here believe this was a clerical error?" No one spoke, because once the truth is made plain, no justification holds. Outside the courthouse, a crowd steadily grew. They brought no banners, only small sheets with names, those once pushed aside. Each person read a name aloud, then walked up the courthouse steps to place it into a wooden box at the entrance. Renee watched through the courtroom window. No chance, no cameras zooming in, but she knew this was the beginning of something bigger than the day's hearing. And Malcolm, as he tapped the bench to conclude the first day, understood too. What he had initiated was not to alter a single verdict. It was to leave a crack, deep enough that no matter who followed in his seat, they could no longer ignore the question now echoing across society. How long have we been asleep to only now realize we need to wake up? The lights in the special courtroom dimmed as the projection screen lit up. A slow-motion surveillance clip played, unedited, unaltered. Footsteps echoed. Chairs scraped. And then, the slap. A dry, cold slap cracked like stone shattering against stone, right in the space once deemed the holiest within the justice system. Travis Brantley, in full uniform, insignia intact, struck Judge Malcolm Varelli across the face, not just an assault on a man, but the bluntest rejection of the neutral justice the entire system had claimed to uphold. The footage slowed at the moment Malcolm's head turned, the light catching the sharp line of his jaw and the gaze that never wavered forward. Not a single word was spoken in the chamber. The eyes of everyone present, from federal judges to representatives of the Executive Oversight Committee, began to lower, slowly, like an involuntary reflex. Not because of the slap, but because they realized the worst part wasn't the violence itself. It was the silence that followed it. Many of them had met Travis before, had shaken his hand, had signed off on warrants based on reports from his unit, and within that downward gaze was something that needed no explanation. At the center of it all, Malcolm remained standing tall. He had never requested that the video be shown to defend himself. He had proposed that it be made public as evidence, but for something larger than himself. When the footage ended and the screen went dark, the room sank into a cold light of clarity. No applause, no words, none of the usual reassurances or gestures of comfort common to such hearing. No one stood. They simply sat there, face to face with a truth now undeniable. That slap hadn't come from one man. It came from the long-standing tolerance and habit of looking away from misused authority. Malcolm took the microphone. He didn't read from a lengthy statement, didn't cite law or invoke power. He simply said one sentence: "Justice does not need revenge. It needs to be protected, even when no one applauds." The words fell like the latch of a closing door, sealing off a murky chapter in judicial history and opening another, where justice was no longer a symbol on a wall, but an action repeated daily, even when no one watches, no one cheats. Renee stood in the hallway, waiting for the signal light to go dark so she could leave the courthouse. In her hand was the draft of tomorrow's editorial. She had written much, exposed much, but had never witnessed change so tangible. Not in legal motions, but in posture. Those who once sat behind the veil of position now left the courtroom with a different walk, slower, heavier, and perhaps more honest. Outside the courthouse, the sign that once read, "One slap, one wake," had been replaced by a new line, "Justice must outlive power." No one knew who wrote it, but as people left, many paused before it. Some took pictures with their phones. Others taped the name of an old victim to the board. A high school girl pulled out a marker and wrote a small line beneath it, "If I stay silent, who will speak?" Then she turned away, not waiting for recognition. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive through a verdict. It arrives through those who believe that, even when no one claps, someone must stand and hold the line between reflex of authority and response of conscience. The emergency meeting was held in a discreet conference room inside the federal headquarters, just a few blocks from the state courthouse. No press, no public, and no formal greetings. This was not a hearing or trial, it was an internal reckoning from those who kept the system running. Judges were not invited based on tenure or rank, but by a single criterion: having once endured disrespect from law enforcement without being able to speak out. Malcolm Varelli was present, but he did not sit at the head of the table. He chose a seat at the back corner, as if to let others speak freely, unburdened by title or reputation. The first to speak was Judge Chloe Hendricks, a black woman from Georgia. She spoke slowly, not out of hesitation, but because she was naming a memory that had never been properly acknowledged. Once, as I entered the courtroom, the officer at the door stopped me and asked me to stand in line for a security check. I told him I was presiding. He asked, "Do you have proof of that?" No one interrupted. She ended with a small shake of her head and a dry gaze. And that's where I've worked for 12 years. Next was Judge Kevin Zhu, of Asian descent, recently appointed to the federal judiciary. He stood, gripping his notebook tightly like it was an anchor. My first day on the bench, I wore the black robe, as required, and my nameplate was already in place, but the officer escorting the defendant still came over and whispered, "Sir, please show your ID." I asked if he realized who he was speaking to. He calmly replied, "I'm not authorized to assume, just following procedure." Chairs shifted slightly. Some scribbled notes, others frowned. No one looked surprised. A wave of silence swept the room, heavy and clinging. Everyone there had their own story, varying only in the degree of dismissal, denial, or suspicion, and it was the very people entrusted with judgment who had once been treated as unqualified because the color of their skin raised more doubt than the weight of their title. Not all spoke that day, but the shared glance across the room confirmed a common truth. If even a judge is asked to prove themselves, how long will it take before ordinary citizens are no longer being stopped? Malcolm remained silent until the very end. When everyone thought the meeting had concluded, he stepped forward gently, carrying no notes or statement. He simply looked at them and said, "If a system demands that those holding the scales of justice must first ask to be treated as human, then that system is broken at its core. And if each of us has a story like that, maybe it's time we stopped leaving them in closed rooms." A different silence settled over the room, not from fear or discomfort, but because his words had struck the exact wound so many had quietly protected, to preserve the dignity of the very institutions they served. Renee Marshall, attending as a media observer, later wrote in her notebook, "Closed session, but memories too real. One day these stories will need to be written, not to condemn, but to remember. Some pain should not stay hidden just because the one carrying it wears a robe." When the meeting ended, no one left right away. They lingered in small clusters, exchanging looks and quiet nods, as if reclaiming something they had long been too cautious to demand: recognition from peers. And perhaps, from that room, a new petition would be born, not to accuse but to redefine what it truly means to stand at the intersection of authority and dignity. Malcolm Varelli sat back in his chair, his hand resting on an open notebook. No one had asked him to speak, and he had not volunteered. The room seemed to understand that sometimes silence does not come from having nothing to say, but from making space for others to speak instead. Before him, the handwritten line stood clear: "No resistance stays silent forever." It wasn't a speech draft, it was a reminder he had written months ago, before the Travis Brantley case broke, a premonition, or perhaps a warning to himself, about the cost of staying quiet for the sake of keeping things. The mood in the room began to shift. After so many personal testimonies, faces long accustomed to public composure now carried a trace of human hesitation. But rather than retreat, they quietly faced each other as allies to a truth too raw to name. An older white judge, known for his conservatism in past hearings, unexpectedly spoke up. He shared no personal story. He simply said, slowly, "I used to think neutral meant not taking sides, but I've come to see that in certain moments, refusing to stand with the wronged is a choice, and it's not neutral at all." That sentence opened the way for a series of nods from people once thought unlikely to ever share a common view. In a space usually governed by rules and protocol, that day unfolded like a conversation that had never been allowed to happen. No one was cut off for running out of time, and no one rushed to conclude with a formal summary. They allowed every grievance, even the smallest, to exist as part of a system that needed to re-examine itself. Near the end of the session, a young female judge from the northeastern United States spoke up, unable to hide her frustration. Professional reflex might be a survival tool in urgent moments, but if this system keeps granting it unchecked privilege, how is that not just legalizing abuse under another name? She didn't look at anyone as she said it, but each word rang loud enough to make several people straighten in their seats. Shortly after, a suggestion was raised, like a strategic proposal: the formation of an interagency subcommittee to re-examine the concept of professional reflex in situations involving the use of force. The idea was still vague, but the way it was received showed that people were aligning around a shared conclusion. If reflex cannot be controlled, then the system must at least be accountable for its consequences. No one objected. A few even began suggesting names of scholars who could be invited, representative scenarios to analyze, and laws that had been overlooked under the label of specific circumstance. Malcolm said nothing for the rest of the session. As attendees began leaving in small groups, he remained seated. Only when a young colleague approached and asked, "Where do you think we should begin?" did he close his notebook and reply, "Start from the place where people believe silence is safest." Then he stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the neighborhood where protests had once erupted after the defining slap. Outside, the city buzzed as always, but within these seemingly immovable walls, something had started to crack. And, if enough people keep that fracture spreading, maybe a new kind of light will find its way in. A final-year law student from Columbia University stood up during a special class on professional ethics and shared the most memorable experience of his education. He recalled his very first internship at the courtroom of Judge Malcolm Varelli. There was no gavel struck to command silence, no threats or forceful demands. Yet the moment Varelli walked in and simply glanced around the murmuring room, every sound almost instantly vanished. "Well, didn't need a gavel," the student said, because his presence alone reminded everyone where the line was. That story was quoted in a legal education newsletter, but it quickly spread as a testament to a kind of leadership that requires no display, yet carries moral gravity. Meanwhile, on social media platforms, the video clip capturing Travis Brantley's sneer in court a week earlier continued to make waves. His contemptuous remark, "We deal with people like this every day," once overshadowed by the slap that followed, had now become a new focal point of public outrage. Renee Marshall was the first to rebroadcast the full footage, not a shortened clip, but a complete edit, showing Travis's aggression from the moment he entered the courtroom. She aired it on national television, pointing out each expression, tone, and deliberately chosen word designed to devalue others. Without dramatizing, she said simply, "When an officer refers to those being arrested as people like this, the system must ask, who are we protecting?" Immediately after the broadcast, the public began resharing that phrase with layered meanings. Across city walls, the words, "people like this," appeared in white paint next to tilted justice scales. Some schools organized discussions on language and power in law enforcement, while legal seminars cited the phrase as a textbook example of distorted professional reflex. It wasn't just a line, it had become a lens, revealing how the system had long normalized systemic insult. Malcolm Varelli made no direct response to the uproar. He maintained his habit to observe the full arc before stepping in, but during a closed forum with federal law students, he chose to speak first. Language doesn't just reveal bias, it shapes the trajectory of conduct. A person may never raise a fist, but the right words spoken in the wrong way can inflict harm and fear. He didn't mention Travis by name, nor refer to the recent trial, but everyone understood the context, and it was precisely his refusal to turn it into a personal feud that made his words all the more powerful. Renee later shared a previously unaired detail. During her sophomore year, Travis had once stopped her while she was covering a field interview. He didn't ask for ID, he simply looked at her skin and listened to her voice, then asked coldly, "Who do you think gave you the right to walk around here?" A decade later, she played that line back, this time in front of millions. No longer a disrespected student, she now shapes public discourse as a journalist with impact. But what haunted her wasn't the words. It was the calm in his eyes as he said them, as if he'd been trained to believe the world would always let it slide. Amid mixed reactions from police unions, the legal community continued pushing for reform in standards of conduct and ethical training. At a federal policy summit, one proposal was introduced: require all police officers to complete mandatory language training before reappointment. Though still debated, the discussion had begun to shift from addressing a single act to questioning systemic roots. And Travis Brantley, though awaiting his next hearing, remained present in every conversation as a warped reflection of what the system had long tried to bury. That so-called professional reflex, when left unchecked, becomes the most dangerous tool for legitimizing contempt. The phrase, "not daily, not anymore," spread through cities like a clear refusal of what used to be called routine. It appeared on shirts, posters, and signs outside courthouses. In Oregon, a group of law students used it to launch a campaign for ethics reform in law enforcement. Legal journals began using it as a title for essays about the long-term damage of treating people's dignity as a procedural afterthought. At a small station in Georgia, a veteran officer stood quietly by the gate he'd passed through for 30 years. His nameplate still shone on a worn-out uniform. That day, he removed it. No one told him to. No one saw him do it. When a young officer asked why, he said, "I used to think silence was loyalty, but I can't teach my child that anymore." The line was shared online and soon became a symbol of quiet, powerful awakening. Renee Marshall ended a column with that quote, "No heroes, no drama. Just this truth. Real change doesn't start in Congress or on cable news. It starts with those who once stayed silent. A simple act, like removing a nameplate, done from clarity, not fear, can shift how a generation sees honor." Judge Malcolm Varelli got a printed copy of the column with a note from a former student. "I used to think you were fair. Now I see fairness isn't just in verdicts, it's in choosing to speak when silence is easier." He reread it, folded the page, and placed it beside his old notebook. The ink had faded, but one line still stood out: "No protest stays silent forever." At a university forum, a professor asked, "If this profession has treated reflex as untouchable, maybe that reflex is what we need to question first." No one replied, but not because they didn't know. It was the first time the question had been asked correctly. From big cities to quiet towns, the phrase kept appearing. Different voices, same meaning. The time for calling silence safe is over, and a new generation now lives differently bravely, clearly, and with dignity. The newly released independent investigation report shook the federal headquarters as if someone had slammed a giant hammer against the thick wall of trust built on oaths and badges. Over the past 8 years, there have been at least 213 internal complaints filed against the unit under Captain Doyle Mercer. What was more shocking was that not a single case had ever been escalated beyond internal handling, regardless of the severity described in the reports. From coerced confessions and improper interrogations to unlawful detentions, every incident was labeled with vague phrases like "requires further monitoring" or "addressed internally by proper procedures." As the numbers went public, the press quickly pushed the story to the top of the headlines. But behind the scenes, the person who brought light to that murky gray zone was Cameron Liu, a young legal staffer who had once assisted Judge Varelli. During a late-night work session, he noticed a strange pattern in how case codes were assigned. Several incidents that had sparked public concern and showed signs of civil rights violations were, upon review, listed under different names in the system or bundled under generic tags like loss of situational control. This made tracing the origins of each case nearly impossible, unless someone with Cameron's patience and acuity took the time to connect the dots. He restructured the data from the entire 8-year span into clusters based on time and location. A pattern emerged. Whenever media or public attention increased, cases involving Captain Mercer's unit were swiftly resolved through changes in terminology or by reassigning officers before launching any internal review. Cameron realized this wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberately repeated mechanism, a system held together by links so tightly bound in administrative language that it became nearly impossible to hold anyone accountable. The next morning, Cameron sent the entire file to Renee Marshall. He understood that releasing the data was not just a professional decision, it was a moral one. Renee took only 10 minutes to verify the first 2 cases, and less than an hour later, a special news segment went live. They call it loss of situational control. But who's controlling whom? And why do all these losses of control involve the same specific population? She asked, staring directly into the camera as she closed her report. Judge Varelli received the segment while in his office. He said nothing, only turned to open his desk drawer and pulled out a stack of old case files previously dismissed for having been thoroughly reviewed by the appropriate law enforcement agency. The way those files had been labeled reminded him of hearings where he had suspected he wasn't being told the full story. Now it was clear. The truth hadn't been denied, it had been diluted by renaming it to blur responsibility. In the courthouse hallway, a records clerk leaned in and whispered to Cameron, "The way you uncovered this made me rethink why I joined this profession. Not to achieve silence, but to make sure truth doesn't get buried." That line never aired on the news, but to Cameron, it made all the sleepless nights and wary stares from coworkers worth it. The truth, in the end, doesn't need to be loud. It just needs someone willing to call it by its original name. And in a season where names were constantly changed, Cameron Liu chose not to rename. He chose the light, even if it came with countless consequences. But that very choice, as Judge Varelli once said, was the most damning verdict against a system that had long kept its place by standing above the pain no one wanted to face. The anonymous audio clip, just under 40 seconds, silenced the entire hearing room. Travis Brantley's voice rang out, arrogant and unfiltered. "I don't fear the law. I've got Mercer." Background noise confirmed it was recorded 3 years ago at a bar outside town, tied to an incident that was quietly buried for lack of evidence. No one denied it. More unsettling, no one seemed surprised. Judge Malcolm Varelli took the podium, his eyes colder than usual. He glanced at Captain Doyle Mercer in the front row and said, "I used to think the greatest threat came from those who broke rules. Now I see it comes from those who guard the gate, then pretend nothing happened." His voice was steady, sharp. Wrongdoing doesn't start at the bottom. It starts where someone redefines what's acceptable. The room tightened. He wasn't condemning a single man. He was exposing a system that had normalized silence, turned protection into policy, and masked deviation as duty. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. For years, acceptable wasn't neutral. It was a choice, made by those with the power to ignore what should have never been overlooked. At the back, Cameron Liu nodded. He had read too many cold phrases. Case reviewed. Insufficient evidence. Situation escalated. Words crafted not to clarify, but to bury. Now, with that recording, they became evidence of a quiet deal. That law didn't need fear, only connections. Across the aisle, Renee Marshall caught the look of a federal judge who once avoided eye contact when Brantley was named on air. Today, she didn't look away. She sat upright, and each pause from Judge Varelli was met with a silent nod, an acknowledgement that silence had cost. The hearing ran 2 hours longer, not from debate but from wait. No one rushed out. Varelli left without shaking hands, closing his notebook with care. On the last page was a single line that echoed louder than any speech. Justice doesn't need to be shouted, it needs to be undeniable. And in that moment, inside what once was a fortress of order, people no longer feared truth, they feared the systems that tolerated its absence. Because what used to be protection was now, finally, evidence. That morning at Central Police Headquarters, there were no banners, no flags at half-staff, no honor guards lined up, but the air was unmistakably heavy. Reporters gathered early, cameras fixed on the podium, not to welcome a new leader, but to mark the quiet collapse of one. At exactly 8:30, Captain Doyle Mercer walked in, uniform pressed, no medals on his chest. He didn't speak. He placed a single sheet of paper on the podium, no heading, no signature. Just one sentence. I defended the department, but I no longer know whom I'm defending. He stepped back, turned around, and left, without a single glance behind. The silence that followed wasn't for mourning. It was the sound of a system being confronted by its reflection. Some reporters whispered the line aloud, others just stared at the ink. The meaning wasn't new. It had been written over the years, through every complaint ignored, every file renamed to hide the truth, every moment the system chose to look away. From the top-floor window, Renee Marshall watched Mercer disappear into the crowd. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She knew some endings don't ask for judgment. They ask for change. That same morning, Judge Malcolm Varelli received a report, 200 pages bound in white, the first line already telling him what he feared. A full audit of all loss of situational control designations from the last 8 years. He didn't open it right away. He just let his hand rest on the cover, eyes closed, remembering that silence, his own, after the strike. Across the street, people were already beginning to gather in front of the building. No call had gone out, but they came anyway. Someone taped a note to the gate. If you don't know who you're defending, maybe you should start listening. Days later, Layla Nouri took the same podium where Mercer had stood. She wore no ribbon, no rank badge beyond what was required. There were no lights, no broadcast, just a quiet room filled with those who needed to see someone stay. Layla had once been denied promotion 3 times, each time told she was too independently minded, but now that phrase appeared across the news, quoted next to her, standing tall, eyes clear. I didn't come to be an example, she said. I came to hold balance. She stepped back without waiting for applause. Behind her were young cadets, interns, and even resigned officers who had returned, not for ceremony, but for closure. On the 4th floor of the federal building, Malcolm stood behind the glass. He declined to attend the event, but he watched. His desk was still piled with files, but his eyes stayed on the square. Beneath the gates, someone had placed a black and white photo, his face frozen in time the moment he was struck. The image had traveled far not because of the violence, but because of how he looked, unwavering, not retaliating, not broken. It was the opposite of what the system once trained. No fear, no outrage, just presence. A little girl walked up with her mother and laid a single white chrysanthemum at the base of the photo. Did it hurt him? She whispered. The mother knelt, brushing the girl's shoulder. Yes, but he stayed, so no one else would have to. The moment recorded by a journalist from across the street, spread online that same night, quiet, tender, but piercing in its clarity. At the press office, Renee Marshall finalized that night's segment. It showed Layla Nouri signing the executive order to remove loss of control from all internal agency reports. Her pen didn't start the movement. It finished what others had made possible by refusing to look away. In a corner cafe near City Hall, Cameron Liu reread the case files that had been returned, this time stamped for judicial review. He underlined the lines he once thought no one would see, but someone had. Someone read them. Someone acted. That morning didn't need a drum roll. It had a sentence, a signature, a hand that held steady, and eyes that finally stayed open. The file reached Renee Marshall just before dusk, delivered through an internal channel with no named sender. The envelope bore no address, but the embossed White House seal made her pause. Inside was a thin letter and a copy of a nomination refusal signed by Malcolm Virelli, dated 2 years earlier. Its opening line was brief but jarring. "Mr. President, I deeply respect the honor, but I cannot accept." Renee sat upright, reading carefully. This was not political prose. One line stood out. "I cannot step onto a higher bench while justice is trampled beneath it." No mention of health or personal reasons, just a moral stance in language that needed no explanation. She halted the evening broadcast, convened the editorial team, and verified the document's authenticity. Then she rewrote the lead. At a time when faith in the legal system is crumbling, one truth emerges. Judge Malcolm Virelli was nominated to the Supreme Court, and he declined. No sensational words. She let the content speak for itself. The news spread fast. The letter's image, along with the quote, went viral, igniting public debate. Why would someone reject the highest seat in law? And what does it mean that he stayed in a state courtroom instead? At the Federal Judicial Academy, a lecture on professional ethics was revised on the spot. A professor projected the letter and asked, "Does justice require the highest seat to be powerful, or the stillest presence when all else wavers?" The question wasn't for the right answer. It was meant to force reflection on the kind of integrity Malcolm had practiced quietly for years. Meanwhile, in his office, Malcolm stayed silent. He never intended to make the refusal public, nor turn it into a legacy. But when the letter spread, he neither denied nor recalled it. He simply placed his notebook back on the shelf, letting silence confirm what needed no defense. That evening, outside the courthouse where Travis had once struck him, someone left a small card. On the cover was a single handwritten line. "Not because you refused to rise, but because you chose to stay." It was pinned beside a faded photo and a small sunflower. The night guard, an older man, stopped and lingered before walking on. In a system long accustomed to evasion, the act of staying put, for the right reasons, still had power to shift the ground beneath it. When Devin Reyes later spoke on live TV, the impact deepened. "He wanted to stay in this city," Reyes said, "because he believed change must start where few are willing to begin." Among thousands of comments flooding in, many paused before typing. Refusing a Supreme Court seat was one thing. Choosing to remain in a place, once seen as justice's blind spot, was something few could explain, yet many understood without needing words. Media outlets everywhere rushed to analyze Malcolm Virelli's true motives. Some policy critics questioned whether he feared being bound by higher-level institutions or if he had simply come to see the limits of power when detached from the ground. But those who had worked alongside him didn't think so. They said Malcolm had always believed that power lay not in position, but in the real impact of each action, even when those actions went unrecognized. That quiet decision triggered a wave of reflection throughout the community. On social media, people shared the image of him being slapped in court with a revised caption that read, "He could have stood higher, but chose to stand closer to the truth." The line quickly appeared on banners, t-shirts, and in community dialogues. Young people began to reevaluate their definitions of success in the justice system, questioning what truly signaled someone worth trusting. At a conference on public service ethics, a lecturer posed a question to the entire hall. Would you choose the position where you can do the most or the place that needs you most? It wasn't a rhetorical question, but after that session, the number of people signing up for community justice programs in historically neglected states doubled compared to the previous year. Not because they wanted to be heroes, but because they had seen how one person, without needing to become a legend, could create tremors just by not abandoning the places already left behind. Malcolm Varelli didn't issue any statements. He continued arriving at court on time, sitting in his usual spot, handling each minor case with the same precision as always. He didn't appear any different. But to those who watched closely, they noticed that every gesture he made, from taking notes to the way he looked people in the eye at the bench, carried a quiet depth that couldn't be captured by logic alone. It was the presence of someone who had chosen the lower ground so he wouldn't lose connection with the roots of injustice. Later, during a discussion among final-year law students, someone asked, if it were you, would you choose the Supreme Court or the state courthouse where you were slapped in the face? A young black woman stood up. She didn't answer directly. She simply said that the day she chose to study law was the day she saw a clip of a man who didn't flinch after being slapped, but said he had been struck in the place of the very idea of justice. The story ended with spontaneous applause, not in praise of Malcolm, but in recognition that sometimes quiet choices can guide generations who've never known the spotlight of power, but begin their search for what's right from the most vulnerable place. At the Kennedy Law School seminar titled, When Justice Gets Slapped, How Do We Respond?, the screen displayed a still image. Malcolm Varelli's profile, Travis Brantley's hand mid-air, and Malcolm's calm gaze. A third-year student asked, why didn't he fight back? The professor, once a federal judiciary lawyer, replied slowly, because if he had, we wouldn't have seen the slapper's face so clearly. That single line became a viral headline and set the tone for what was no longer just a legal debate, but a moral reckoning. A student speaker recalled her first day as an intern when a court officer stopped her despite her credentials. Malcolm himself had come to escort her, saying only, the person beside me today will be in your place tomorrow. That moment shifted how she was treated afterward, not because she was remembered, but because someone from within had taken notice. It wasn't about a rule. It was about someone choosing to speak at the right time. The seminar had no conclusion, but long conversations followed. A group proposed naming Malcolm an honorary lecturer, not for teaching, but for the silent lesson he embodied, that stillness could strip power of its mask. The next day, an unsigned article appeared in the student newspaper titled, A Law Student Relearning Humanity, titled, How Resistance Means Standing Still, Letting Truth Emerge Through Restraint Instead of Noise. Malcolm didn't attend the seminar. When shown the article, he folded it wordlessly. But in court that same day, he opened with a new question. Has anyone here ever been stopped because of their appearance? Nearly half the room raised their hands. He said nothing more, but the message was clear. Even justice had to face the biases it long ignored. Soon after, posters of Malcolm appeared across campus, his profile calm, the red handprint stark on his cheek, eyes unshaken. No one claimed the photo or its release, but from one anonymous post, the image spread from lecture halls to major newspapers, becoming a quiet but undeniable symbol of dignity that refused to flinch. At Howard University, a group of law students hung that photo at the entrance to the main academic building. Beneath it, in bold letters, read, "He didn't flinch, so we had to face it." The slogan was simple but carried layered meaning. It didn't dwell on pain or brutality. It forced viewers to confront their reactions to what was unfolding. The image didn't evoke pity. It stirred self-examination. Professors began using that image to open their lectures, not to provoke emotion, but to raise questions. If you were a witness, what would you have done? If you held authority, how would you redefine the boundaries of professional reflex? During a seminar on legal ethics, one veteran lecturer stood in silence for several seconds after showing the clip before answering any question. He simply said, "When someone chooses to stand still so we can fully see a wrong, That is a debt of awareness, and that debt must be repaid with action, not gratitude. A group of media students curated a photo exhibit titled Public Silence, Private Impact, with Malcolm's image at the center, surrounded by excerpts from speeches, resignation letters, and testimonies from individuals who had been mistreated due to their race. They didn't build a monument, didn't retouch or reinterpret the photo. Instead, they displayed Malcolm's face with the raw grain of the original shot, an unprocessed print, because the truth doesn't need smoothing. On the wall of a senior dormitory, a handwritten note was taped up with clear adhesive. I used to think silence was weakness, but then I understood. Sometimes, composure is what makes the entire system pause. The note was unsigned, but by the next morning, 12 more pieces of paper had appeared beside it. Each carried a personal story, from being denied entry at security checkpoints for looking unusual to being subtly profiled just for having non-Western names. Those stories were copied, submitted to the conference committee, and compiled into a report sent directly to the Department of Justice, alongside a proposal to expand training on professional reflex and unconscious bias in the legal system. At a high school in southern Atlanta, a civics teacher pinned Malcolm's photo to the class bulletin board. A 10th grade student asked, if he was so strong, why didn't he hit back? The teacher replied, because he didn't choose to win. He chose to let others see clearly what he was losing. The answer was written into the student's semester notebook, and by year's end, it became the subject of his graduation essay. The photo was never submitted for any awards. It wasn't featured in mainstream campaigns. But wherever it appeared, no one looked away without wondering, had they once turned their head? And, if given the chance to look again, would they have the courage not to bow, like Malcolm did in the moment when a whole society was forced to confront its reflection? On the day of Travis Brantley's federal trial, the courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights groups, and those who had demanded justice for weeks. Travis appeared not in uniform, but in standard prison attire, seated behind the metal barrier alongside other defendants. He had no private attorney, no special holding room. The presiding judge, a woman once blocked by Travis when she was just a prosecutor's aide, spoke in a steady voice, each word carrying the weight of quiet resolve. She began by reading a short handwritten letter from Malcolm Varelli. Justice does not choose who to humiliate. It chooses who must correct themselves first, and the only thing a court can do is remind us of that every day. No applause followed, but the silence was heavy. Renee Marshall took notes without expression. Everything she once said now echoed in the official charges. The prosecution laid out uncut evidence of tampered records, erased reports, and public misconduct. An old recording was played. I don't fear the law, I have Mercer. That name, once a symbol of protection, now marked a resignation. A mother testified, recalling her son's eyes after a night in custody for suspicious behavior. She said softly, he no longer trusts the police. But what hurts most is he no longer trusts the court. An internal report revealed 213 complaints against Travis's unit, most buried under administrative jargon. Expert witness Cameron Liu explained how language had been used to obscure systemic protection. By late morning, Travis's defense requested a delay. The judge denied it. Justice has waited long enough, and if truth has a price, it shouldn't be paid in installments. The quote made headlines by evening, summarizing a journey from one slap to the unmasking of an entire belief system. After the session, a young court employee left a handwritten note at the registry. I joined for the law. I'm staying because I believe it can fix itself. No signature was needed. The verdict was pronounced. 8 years in prison, no special appeal rights, permanent revocation of all policing authority. No cheers followed. This wasn't a victory. It was overdue. Travis stood silently. Federal agents closed their laptops without comment. No handshakes. Just quiet stares from those learning to face truths long denied. As he passed the row where victims' families had sat, his eyes met the mother's. She did not flinch, nor did she scowl. She looked at him like someone once faithful to the law, trying to salvage a fragment of belief. Travis lowered his head, not out of duty but because no words remained. Outside, the crowd was small. One flyer read, "We cannot hammer silence into compliance. Sometimes silence forces us to listen." No media frenzy followed. What mattered had already happened. The courtroom became a mirror for what the system once called protocol. Elsewhere, law students gathered to reflect. On screen was the image of Travis bowing at sentencing. A young woman said, "He once believed he was untouchable because he knew the system. But what stayed with me was her gaze, not angry, just tired. Tired of waiting to be believed again." At City Hall, Malcolm Varelli returned to his files, declining press briefings. When asked for comment, he said, "It was necessary, and necessity should never be turned into spectacle." Beneath a yellow desk lamp, he continued working, believing that wounds, even deep ones, could heal if stitched with care, even if they left scars. Travis exited through the rear transport gate. Inside the van, hands folded on his knees, he stared ahead. Through the small window, he caught sight of the wall where Malcolm's photo still hung, red handprint vivid against the town's center. He did not look away. He didn't cry, but his shoulders had softened, because perhaps for the first time he understood that the true collapse of a man doesn't begin with losing power, but with losing the right to believe in himself. The sculpture was placed at the center of the plaza, in front of the federal courthouse, the very sight of the slap that echoed beyond a judge's face to shake the system's perception of power and resistance. It was an open hand, palm facing upward, not shaped after any specific person. No ornate details, no attempt to recreate pain or anger. Just a hand, fingers gently spread, as if it had endured and released. The artist left no signature. There was no unveiling ceremony. At the statue's base, a small bronze plaque sat low to the ground, requiring one to bow slightly to read it. "Not all resistance fights back. Some just refuse to fall." The message needed no further explanation. Those who followed the story understood the hand did not represent power, but the choice to remain wounded yet visible, so others could see the one who struck. Each day, students walking past stopped. Some left small notes, others laid white flowers. Yet no one turned it into a spectacle. Silence around the sculpture seemed to command a natural respect. During a school field trip, a group of students gathered around the monument. Their teacher asked each of them to share one thing they remembered from the case. A Mexican boy quietly said, "I remember when he stood still, and the whole room fell silent with him." A Somali girl added, "If he had reacted like we usually do, no one would remember it now." Their scattered remarks connected through a shared feeling. Something in that image made them feel seen and heard, even though they had never set foot inside a courtroom. Inside the courthouse, business continued as usual, but people noticed that Malcolm Varelli's wooden gavel, once used during proceedings, was now displayed in a glass case, with a small label, "Once necessary," now replaced by "Listening." No one ordered this change. A longtime staff member simply said, "I think he wanted people to understand that justice doesn't need to strike hard to be respected." On social media, images of the statue spread quickly. There were no debates about its meaning. Instead, people shared personal reflections. A writer posted, "I used to think resistance meant stomping forward. But maybe standing still when insulted is harder because it forces us to face the truth we can't escape." A human rights professor added, "The statue doesn't glorify anyone nor accuse. It's simply a place for memories to stop quietly, without being erased." Layla Nuri, who had just been appointed as the new head of the federal police, replacing Doyle Mercer, made a quiet stop at the plaza before her first day in office. She wore no uniform and brought no entourage. Standing before the sculpture, Layla pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket. On it was written, "I promise not to look away." She tucked it into the edge of the stone, among dozens of other vows, then walked away in silence. Malcolm Varelli's decision to stay where justice is most fragile no longer appears in flashy headlines. It's the answer some parents give when their children ask, "What is justice?" Sometimes it's just an open hand in the middle of a city that once looked away, a hand that doesn't strike but stays steady, reminding us that silence, too, can reshape the meaning of dignity. Every year on the date Malcolm was slapped in court, People gather quietly outside the courthouse. No stage, no microphones, just candles, white papers, and people arriving on their own. They don't come to praise or protest, but to stop, to reflect, and to remember when justice was ignored where it should have stood strongest. Law students stand beside professors, sharing that space and story. Some know the exact words Malcolm wrote by hand for the Brantley trial. A student once said, "I thought instinct meant reaction. He showed me that calm could be strength." And that thought now lives beyond classroom. One elderly woman comes each year, placing a daisy by the stone hand statue. The slap didn't hurt him like our silence did, she tells a passerby. A young girl once asked her mom, "Did he hit back?" The answer was quiet but lasting. No, he wanted us to see who should be ashamed. A quote from Malcolm's notebook now rests by the candles. Justice doesn't need revenge. It needs protection, even if no one claps. That quiet act, repeated each year, now speaks louder than slogans. And each time someone walks by, the real question isn't about the man's name, but whether, if they saw it happen again, they'd look away or choose to stay. In a lecture hall in Johannesburg, Professor Matembu, a leading expert on post-apartheid law, began his final class of the semester by displaying an image of Malcolm Varelli and the courtroom video. The lights dimmed as he said, "We've studied the slaps of the apartheid regime, but this one, in a society that claims to be just, is even more staggering." He asked students not to analyze procedural law, but to examine the fragile line between authority and dignity. His closing question wasn't on the exam, it settled in their hearts. If it were you, would you sit in silence or stand and speak? At the National Judicial School in Seoul, a quote from Malcolm Varelli was projected in the central lobby where students passed each morning. "Justice isn't about who wins. It's about who doesn't look away." Printed in white on a gray background beneath the national emblem, the quote became an annual first-year debate topic. One student group once wrote, "We don't live in an ideal society, but without people like him, we wouldn't even know where to begin." The case spread beyond borders, not through loud headlines, but by slowly shaping the professional conscience of a new generation. Far across the globe, in a small mountain town in Peru, a young judge named Mateo Ramos had just concluded his first trial under pressure from multiple sides. Late at night, he wrote a letter to the U.S. sharing how he had often considered resigning due to the isolation of upholding rulings against vague calls from higher-ups. But after reading Malcolm's testimony and rewatching the video dozens of times, he wrote, "If he could stand still in the face of rage without bowing, then I can stand firm where I've been entrusted." He ended with a simple sentence, "Thank you for not responding with hate. That's what reminded me that our work still matters." The letter, after a long journey across the ocean, landed on Malcolm's desk one late afternoon. He didn't speak, nor did he write a reply. He simply folded the paper neatly, smoothed its edge, and walked to the old wooden cabinet in the corner of his office. The bottom drawer, often overlooked, was where he kept things that weren't accolades. There were no medals, honorary degrees, or clippings, just a few handwritten letters, student note scraps, draft pages, and brief thank you notes without return addresses. That was where he stored what made him feel worthy to keep doing the work. Renee Marshall once asked him, during a rare moment when both stayed late, "Why don't you hang those things on the wall?" Malcolm only shrugged and looked out the window. He didn't answer directly, but later said, "I don't think people should remind themselves every day of when they did right. I think they need reminders of the times they almost got it wrong and stopped just in time." While others debated reform laws, image management, and departmental procedures, Malcolm quietly returned to court, past the hallway where his slapping image had once covered the columns, and entered the courtroom with a worn notebook. He rarely spoke of what happened, but every word he wrote and every decision he made carried an echo, not of applause, but of reckoning. Malcolm Varelli left the courthouse the same way he entered it, quietly, with no camera lights, no farewell ceremony. His office, once the place where rulings were delivered with cold determination, now stood empty. There were no framed photos on the desk, no medals, no farewell cards. Only a simple notebook sat neatly in place. On the first page, written in slanted handwriting, was a message for whoever came next. Justice doesn't have to win. It just has to outlast the silence. It was not a lament, nor a blind belief, but the distilled essence of a journey, where endurance sometimes speaks louder than forceful declarations. For years, Malcolm didn't win every case. He wasn't always supported. But what made him an anchor for a generation wasn't his victories. It was that he never stopped illuminating the wrong, even when others chose to look away. He was slapped in court, but he didn't step down. He didn't respond with force, nor did he speak immediately. He let the wrongful act expose itself, unmasked, stripped of justification. That moment was when justice didn't need to shout, yet compelled an entire system to fall into silence and listen. What followed that slap wasn't merely disciplinary action. It was a wave of deep reform, spreading from the courtroom to the classroom, from public offices to family dinner tables. Travis Brantley's sarcastic remark, once deemed normal in the profession, became a cited example in law schools. The photo of Malcolm standing still with a red handprint became a teaching tool for dignity and self-control. And even those who never met him, like a little girl passing the courthouse years later, heard the story from her parents as part of the collective memory. The lesson from Malcolm Varelli's journey wasn't about legal victories. It lay in his choice not to look away, even when silence was the easier path. He refused to be molded by so-called norms, if those norms tolerated humiliation, injustice, and the invisible slaps dealt daily. While many used their power to shield colleagues, he used composure to expose what the system needed to confront. When offered a chance to rise to the highest position, he declined, not out of a lack of ambition, but because he believed the place needing repair most was the one left neglected. Malcolm's persistent presence forced many others to re-examine themselves. Several veteran officers submitted their resignations after realizing they had once stayed silent in the face of misconduct. A new generation of cadets entered the force, with banners that bore no national colors, no loud slogans, only the words he once spoke. Stone plaques were erected without names, because what mattered wasn't who was remembered, but what made people start to look again. When Malcolm left office, it wasn't called a retirement. It was called a passing on, not of power, but of responsibility. The responsibility to live in a way that keeps justice from being forgotten, to ensure the vulnerable never feel alone, and to help justice, even if slowly, find its path through the darkest corners of silence. This story doesn't call for sudden heroics. It reminds us that real change comes not from shouting, but from those who choose to stand firm where they are and refuse to close their eyes to what's wrong. If there's anything to remember, it's that justice was never a wall built in advance. It's every brick laid by the hands of people who don't need to be remembered, only echoed in the actions of those who come next. And sometimes, one person who doesn't walk away after being slapped can make an entire system stop, just long enough to relearn how to face what's right. This isn't just a story about a slap in a courtroom. It's a reminder that sometimes what shakes an entire system isn't a shout, but the quiet resolve of someone who refuses to bow. Malcolm Varelli didn't need a podium to become a symbol. He only needed to stand still long enough and firm enough for a whole society to be forced to look at itself. And if you still remember him today, the most important thing isn't his name, but the question he left behind. When justice is insulted, will you stay silent or will you stand your ground?